The crystal glass felt cold and heavy in my hand, a stark contrast to the boiling rage and humiliation that was coursing through my veins. It was Thanksgiving, a day meant for gratitude and family, but as I stood in my brother's house, I had never felt more alone or more despised. My sister-in-law, Amelia, had just raised her own glass for a toast, her voice ringing out with a manufactured sweetness that failed to mask the venom beneath. "To family," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room, past her parents, past her own siblings, and landing on me with a pointed chill. "The family we choose, the ones who lift us up and make our lives better. We are so blessed to have such successful, wonderful people to share our lives with." She then turned her gaze to my brother, Daniel, and added, "And we are so excited to build a future for our baby surrounded by only the best influences." The meaning was as clear as the expensive wine in her glass. I was not one of the chosen. I was not successful. I was not a good influence. I was the drab, aging sister in a second-hand dress, a blight on the perfect picture she was painting. I could feel the eyes of her family on me, a mixture of pity and discomfort. My own brother, my sweet Daniel, whom I had raised since he was 10 years old, just stared down at his plate, his silence a louder condemnation than any word Amelia could have spoken. The beautiful gravy boat I had brought as a gift, a vintage piece from our mother's collection, sat unused on a side table, replaced by a modern ceramic one that matched Amelia's minimalist decor. It was another small, deliberate rejection in a long line of them. For the past 5 years, ever since Amelia had entered our lives, I had been living in a state of quiet bewilderment, trying to understand the source of her intense, unwavering hatred for me. Before her, Daniel and I were everything to each other. When our parents were taken from us in a brutal car crash, I was only 22, and he was a heartbroken little boy of 10. My own life, my dreams of university and a career in art, vanished overnight. My world shrank to a singular purpose: Daniel. I worked 2 jobs, scrubbing floors and waiting tables to keep our small house, to make sure he had food on the table, new shoes for school, and some semblance of a normal childhood. I never resented it. Every sacrifice was a testament to my love for him. The pride I felt watching him graduate from high school, then college, was more fulfilling than any personal achievement I could have imagined. He was my son, my brother, my best friend, all rolled into one. He would call me every day, come over for dinner 3 times a week, and tell me I was the most important person in his world. Then he met Amelia at a corporate event for the bank where he worked. She was beautiful, polished, and came from a family with money and influence. I was happy for him, truly. I saw the way his eyes lit up when he talked about her, and all I wanted was his happiness. The first time I met her, I tried my best. I baked her my famous lemon meringue pie and wore my nicest blouse. She was polite, but in a distant, analytical way. She surveyed my small, humble home with an unreadable expression, her eyes lingering on the worn furniture and the patched-up wallpaper. "It's very cozy," she had said, and the word felt like an insult. From that day on, a wall began to rise between my brother and me, brick by invisible brick. The daily phone calls became weekly, then monthly. The dinner visits dwindled. When I did see him, Amelia was always there, a silent gatekeeper. She would answer my questions for him, her hand always possessively on his arm. If I told a story from their childhood, she would feign a yawn or change the subject, as if erasing our shared history. She made it clear that my world of second-hand clothes and careful budgeting was an embarrassment to the new, aspirational life she was building with Daniel. I tried to bridge the gap. For their wedding, I spent months knitting a beautiful, intricate blanket, a pattern our grandmother had taught me. I poured hundreds of hours and all my love into it. At the wedding shower, surrounded by her wealthy friends and their extravagant gifts from designer stores, Amelia opened my present, held it up for a moment, and said with a tight smile, "How very crafty." I later saw the blanket in a donation bin behind their apartment complex. Another time, for Daniel's birthday, I wanted to give him something special, so I sold our mother's wedding ring. It was the last piece of expensive jewelry I owned, and it broke my heart to part with it, but I wanted Daniel to have the new laptop he needed for his work. I gave him the cash, $2,000, in an envelope, telling him it was some money I had saved. A week later, Amelia posted a photo on social media of a new designer handbag. "My husband knows how to spoil me," the caption read. Daniel never even mentioned the laptop. Her cruelty was a slow-acting poison, administered in small, calculated doses. She would forget to invite me to parties. She would schedule family events on days she knew I had to work my part-time job at the library. She spoke to me in a condescending tone, as if I were a simple-minded child, often explaining basic things to me in a loud, slow voice. "Clara, this is a quiche. It's a bit like an egg pie, it's French." I had been making quiche for Daniel since he was a boy. The worst part was Daniel's complicity. He saw it all, yet he did nothing. He stood by as his wife systematically dismantled the most important relationship in his life. The shame and guilt in his eyes were sometimes visible, a flicker of the loving brother he used to be, but it was always quickly extinguished by a placating look towards Amelia. He had made his choice. He had chosen her world, her values, her family. And in that world, there was no place for a poor, lonely older sister who reminded him of a past he was clearly desperate to forget. Now, with a baby on the way, Amelia's campaign against me had escalated. It was no longer about simple exclusion. It was about eradication. She wanted to erase me from Daniel's life completely, ensuring their child would never even know me. This Thanksgiving toast was her declaration of war. As her family members clinked their glasses, I quietly set mine down on the table, the lump in my throat so large I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Daniel by the shoulders and ask him how he could let this happen. I wanted to list every sacrifice, every long night, every dollar I had ever spent on him, not to guilt him, but to simply make him remember. But I did none of those things. I was a guest in their home, an unwelcome one, and causing a scene would only prove Amelia's point that I was unstable and lacking in social graces. So I held my head high, forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster, and endured the rest of the dinner in near silence. I listened to Amelia's father boast about his latest stock market win. I listened to her mother plan an extravagant baby shower. I listened as they all planned a future for my brother and his child that felt a million miles away from me. As I was leaving, Daniel walked me to the door. It was the first time we had been alone all evening. "Clara, he started, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't finish. The guilt was choking him. "It's a beautiful house, Danny," I said softly, using my old nickname for him. "You've done well for yourself." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with an unspoken apology that was years too late. She's very protective right now. The hormones," he mumbled, a pathetic excuse that we both knew was a lie. "Of course," I said, not wanting to fight. "You too should be protective of what you have." Before he could say anything else, Amelia appeared at his side, her arms snaking around his waist. Her smile was triumphant. "Drive safe, Clara," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. The roads can be so dangerous at night for older drivers. It was one last, parting shot. I was not just poor and uncultured, I was old and decrepit too. I walked to my car, a 15-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door, and drove away from their perfect house in their perfect neighborhood. The tears I had been holding back all night finally came, hot and bitter. It wasn't just the humiliation that hurt. It was the profound sense of loss. I had lost my brother. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved more than anyone in the world, was a stranger to me now, a willing captive in a life where I was the villain. And I had absolutely no idea why. What had I ever done to Amelia to deserve such hatred? Why was my very existence such a threat to her? That night, alone in my quiet little house, I couldn't sleep. The question echoed in my mind over and over. Why? I replayed every interaction, every conversation, searching for a clue. Had I said something to offend her? Had I unknowingly crossed some invisible line? But there was nothing. Her hostility had been there from the very beginning, a solid, impenetrable wall. I thought about the money. Could it be that simple? Did she resent my inability to shower them with expensive gifts like her own family did? It seemed plausible. To someone like Amelia, whose self-worth was so clearly tied to wealth and status, my frugal existence must have seemed like a personal failure, a stain on her new family's reputation. She didn't see the dignity in my simple life. She only saw the poverty. She didn't see the sacrifices I had made. She saw a woman who had failed to achieve anything of note. As the first hints of dawn crept through my window, a cold resolve settled over me. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't live as a ghost in my own family, silently absorbing blow after blow. The pain of the previous night had solidified into something harder, something more determined. I needed to understand. Even if it meant confronting the ugliest of truths, I had to know why my brother's wife hated me so much. But more than that, I had to find a way to reach the brother I knew was still buried somewhere inside that stranger. My first step was a painful one. I went to the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed and unlocked it. Inside, nestled amongst old photographs and my parents' wedding album, was a worn leather ledger. I opened it with trembling hands. For years, this book had been my most painful secret, a burden I carried in absolute silence. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the neat columns of dates and numbers. Each entry represented a piece of my life, a small part of my own comfort and security, signed away. It had started 7 years ago, 2 years before Daniel even met Amelia. He had called me in the middle of the night, his voice frantic and broken. He had made a terrible mistake. A series of bad investments, he'd called them, but I later learned the truth. It was gambling. He had fallen in with a bad crowd and had amassed a staggering debt to a man who was not the forgiving type. The total was $150,000. $150,000 that he didn't have. He was terrified, talking about running away, about how his life was over before it had even begun. The loan shark was threatening to break his legs, to ruin his reputation at the bank, to destroy everything. I didn't hesitate. I drained my small savings account, the money I had carefully put aside for my parents' life insurance, which was meant for my own retirement. It was barely enough to cover the first few interest payments. I sold my car and started taking the bus. I took on a second, then a third part-time job, and then I made the deal. I met the loan shark, a terrifying man named Marco, in a dingy back alley office. I showed him my pay stubs, my bank statements, and I made him a promise I would pay it off. Every single month, without fail, I would send him a payment of $1,500. It would take years, nearly a decade, but I would do it. Marco, seeing the steely determination in my eyes and perhaps finding the arrangement novel, agreed. As long as the money kept coming, Daniel would be left alone. And so it began. Every month for the last 7 years, the first and most important bill I paid was the one that went to Marco. It was a crippling amount. It left me with barely enough to cover my mortgage and utilities. It was why I bought my clothes at thrift stores, why I ate soup and sandwiches for dinner most nights, why I could never afford to fix the rattling noise in my old car or the leak in my roof. Daniel had been so relieved, so grateful. He had cried and promised he would pay me back one day, that he would make it up to me. But as the months turned into years, the shame seemed to morph into something else. We never spoke of it again. It became a silent, ugly secret between us. He went on with his life, building his career, meeting Amelia, buying a beautiful house, all while I was secretly cleaning up the biggest mess of his life. Looking at the ledger, I saw the numbers starkly. I had paid, to date, $126,000. $126,000 of my own sweat and sacrifice, only $24,000 to go. The end was in sight, but it felt a world away. Amelia had no idea about any of this. To her, I wasn't a savior. I was just Daniel's poor sister. She saw my shabby coat and judged me, never imagining that the coat was shabby because my brother was wearing my money in the form of his designer suit. She scoffed at my old car, never knowing that she was driving around in the new one I had paid for. Every ounce of her disdain was rooted in a lie that Daniel and I had silently agreed to maintain. His shame and my unconditional love had built the prison I now lived in. Clutching the ledger to my chest, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The numbers on the pages were not a record of my poverty, They were a record of my strength. They were the proof of my love for a brother who had lost his way. Amelia could mock my worn clothes and my humble life, but she could never understand the fortune I had spent to preserve her husband's future. My silence was not a sign of weakness, it was a shield. But now, that shield was beginning to feel more like a cage, and I knew I couldn't stay inside it forever. I decided on a new strategy. A frontal assault would be a disaster. Arguing with Amelia would only make me look hysterical, and confronting Daniel about the debt would only drive him further away out of shame. No, I had to try a different approach, a gesture of peace. The baby was the key. An innocent new life, a bridge between our two fractured worlds. If I could show Amelia that I wanted to be a loving aunt, that I could be a positive force in her child's life, perhaps she would finally lower her defenses. The baby shower Amelia's mother had mentioned was the perfect opportunity. I knew I wouldn't be invited, but that didn't matter. I would make a gift, something so personal and so filled with love that it couldn't possibly be dismissed. I put the ledger away and went to the small workshop in my garage, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was dusty and smelled of old wood and turpentine. In the corner, under a tarp, was my father's old whittling kit. He had been a carpenter, but his true passion was carving small, intricate birds. He had taught me the skill when I was a little girl, and it was one of my most cherished memories of him. I would make a mobile for the baby's crib, a flock of hand-carved, hand-painted birds, each one unique, just like the ones my father had made for Daniel's crib all those years ago. It was more than a gift. It was a piece of our family, a piece of the grandfather the child would never know. For the next 3 weeks, I poured every spare moment into the project. My fingers, stiff from disuse, quickly remembered the familiar motions. I carved robins and blue jays, sparrows and goldfinches. I sanded each one until it was perfectly smooth, and then I painted them with delicate, lifelike detail. As I worked, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I was connecting with my father, with my own history, and with the new generation of our family. I wasn't thinking about Amelia's judgment or Daniel's silence. I was simply creating something beautiful out of love. The Saturday of the shower arrived, a bright, cold afternoon. As expected, no invitation had come. I wrapped the finished mobile carefully in soft tissue paper and placed it in a simple brown box tied with a white ribbon. My plan was to drop it off at their house with a card, a quiet offering of peace. But as I was getting my coat on, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "Clara, hi," he said, his voice strained. "Are you busy right now?" I was just about to head out for a bit. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause. I could hear Amelia's muffled voice in the background, sharp and angry. "Look," Daniel said, his voice dropping lower. "The baby shower is today. It's at our house. I know it's last minute, but I really want you to be there. Please." "Daniel, it's all right. I know Amelia did." "She forgot," he cut in, the lie sounding flimsy even to his own ears. "She's been so swamped with everything. But I didn't forget. It wouldn't be a family celebration without you. I can come pick you up in 20 minutes. My heart ached for him, for the pathetic desperation in his voice. He was trapped between his wife and his sister, and he was a coward, but he was still my brother. He was trying, in his own weak way, to do the right thing. "Okay, Danny," I said softly. "I'll be ready." When I stepped into their house, it was like entering another world. The air was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and catered food. Laughter and light chatter echoed off the high ceilings. The room was a sea of pastel silks and designer labels. At least 50 women were there, all of them friends or family of Amelia. I, in my simple navy blue dress, the nicest thing I owned, felt like a crow that had wandered into a flock of peacocks. Amelia saw me walk in, and a flicker of pure fury crossed her face before it was replaced by a brittle society smile. "Clara, Daniel insisted you come," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, making it clear this was not her decision. "So glad you could make it." She gave me a perfunctory air kiss that never made contact with my cheek and immediately turned her attention to a guest who was admiring her diamond earrings. I found a quiet corner and stood there, nursing a glass of water, feeling deeply and profoundly out of place. I watched as the mountain of gifts grew higher and higher. A stroller that probably cost more than my car. A miniature Gucci diaper bag. A sterling silver rattle from Tiffany's. My small brown box felt impossibly humble, almost foolish. Finally, the time came for Amelia to open her presents. She sat in a large, throne-like chair, glowing with maternal pride, as her friends oohed and awed over each extravagant item. My gift was, of course, saved for last. One of her friends picked it up. "This one doesn't have a tag from a store," she noted, holding it out. "Oh, that must be from Clara," Amelia said, her voice laced with a familiar, condescending sweetness. She took the box and unwrapped it slowly. She lifted the mobile from the tissue paper, the little wooden birds dangling and turning gently in the air. A few of the guests murmured in appreciation. "Oh, how lovely," one older woman said. "Did you make this yourself, dear?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Amelia held it up, examining it with a critical eye. She ran a perfectly manicured finger over one of the carved wings. "It's very rustic," she said, the word dripping with the same disdain she had used for my knitted blanket. Then she looked directly at me, a cold smile playing on her lips. "I'm not sure about the splinters, though. And the paint, is it non-toxic? We're trying to create a very clean, allergen-free environment for the baby. But thank you for the thought, Clara. It's a very sweet gesture." She handed the mobile to her mother without a second glance, as if it were a piece of trash to be disposed of, and immediately began thanking everyone for their wonderful store-bought gifts. The humiliation was a physical blow. It was so public, so deliberate, so cruel. She hadn't just rejected my gift, she had implied it was dangerous, that my love was somehow toxic to her unborn child. I saw Daniel standing near the kitchen, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He had seen the whole thing, and once again, he had done nothing. I couldn't stay a moment longer. I quietly set my water glass down and slipped out the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. The cold air felt good on my burning cheeks. My gesture of peace had been thrown back in my face. My attempt to bridge the gap had only given her a new weapon to use against me. There was nothing left to try. As I was fumbling for my keys in my purse, the front door opened again. It was Amelia's mother, holding my mobile. "Dear," she said, her expression a mixture of pity and something else I couldn't quite read. "Amelia can be particular. Please don't take it to heart." "It's fine," I mumbled, just wanting to leave. "It's a beautiful piece of work," she said, looking at the birds. "It reminds me of the things my own father used to make." She seemed genuinely touched, which was more than I could say for her daughter. As she turned to go back inside, Amelia's voice drifted out from the open doorway. She was speaking to her best friend, her voice low but sharp. "I cannot believe he made me invite her. It's bad enough that we're still dealing with that whole situation with Marco, and now she's trying to worm her way back in with her sad little charity projects. I just want her gone." I froze, my keys halfway to the car door. Marco, she had said Marco, it was not a common name. It couldn't be a coincidence. Amelia, my polished, perfect sister-in-law, knew the name of the lone shark who held my brother's life and my own in his hands. But her tone wasn't one of fear or concern. It was one of irritation, of annoyance, as if the debt, the secret that had defined my existence for 7 years, was nothing more than an inconvenient social problem, like a stain on the carpet. 100 questions exploded in my mind. How did she know? What did she know? What was that whole situation? And if she knew about the debt, did she know who was paying it? A sickening realization began to dawn on me. Her hatred of me, it wasn't just about my poverty or my simple life. It was something deeper, something connected to this secret. She didn't just want me out of the way because I was an embarrassment. She wanted me gone because I was a loose end. I wasn't just the poor sister. I was the keeper of a secret that she, for some reason, wanted to remain buried. My mission was no longer about seeking understanding or making peace. It was about uncovering the truth. And for the first time, I was truly afraid of what that truth might be. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed alien, the headlights of oncoming cars like the eyes of predatory animals. My mind was a vortex, swirling around a single, impossible word: Marco. The name was a key, but I had no idea what lock it fit. It was clear now that Amelia's animosity was not the simple, petty cruelty of a snob. It was calculated. It was defensive. She wasn't pushing me away because she looked down on me. She was pushing me away because she was afraid of me. Afraid of what I represented. Afraid of what I knew or what she thought I knew. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the cold car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The gift box with the bird mobile sat on the passenger seat, a pathetic symbol of my own naivety. I had tried to offer love to a woman who saw me as a threat. The realization was chilling. Daniel and Amelia weren't just a couple building a future, they were partners in a conspiracy, and I was the primary obstacle. Her words echoed in my head. It's bad enough that we're still dealing with that whole situation with Marco. We're, not just Daniel, we. This implied a shared history, a shared problem. I finally went inside, my body moving on autopilot. I made a cup of tea, my hands shaking so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer. I sat at my small kitchen table and tried to piece it together. The timeline was all wrong. Daniel met Amelia 5 years ago. He got into trouble with Marco 7 years ago. He had told me he was alone in it, that his shame was his to bear. But if Amelia knew Marco, if she was part of the we who were still dealing with him, then she must have been in Daniel's life much earlier than I ever knew. He had lied to me, not just by omission, but by constructing an entirely false history of their relationship. Why? Why would he hide her from me? My mind, now sharp with adrenaline and betrayal, started connecting the dots. The sudden change in him after he met her. The way he pulled away, not just emotionally, but financially. He had been so apologetic about not being able to help me with household repairs or bills, claiming his new life with Amelia was expensive. I had always accepted it, thinking it was just the cost of his happiness. But now, another, uglier possibility emerged. What if he wasn't just being selfish? What if he was being controlled? I needed proof. I couldn't confront them with just a half-overheard sentence. They would deny it, call me crazy, and use it as further evidence of my supposed mental decline. I had to find something concrete, something that couldn't be explained away. My house, the house Daniel grew up in, was a museum of our past. He had moved most of his things out when he got his own apartment, but there were still boxes in the attic, things he deemed not important enough to take, but too sentimental to throw away. High school yearbooks, old photo albums, boxes of college textbooks. Perhaps, buried in that mountain of forgotten memories, there was a clue. With a newfound sense of purpose, I pulled down the rickety ladder to the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of aging paper. I flicked on the single bare bulb, casting long, dancing shadows across the cluttered space. I found the corner labeled Daniel's Things and started pulling down the heavy, sealed boxes. I spent hours sifting through the remnants of the boy I had raised. I saw his report cards, all straight A's, and remembered how proud I had been. I found a clay handprint he made for me in first grade, my name clumsily scratched into the top. I saw photographs of us on camping trips, at his graduation, at Christmas, his arm always slung around my shoulders, his face beaming with a genuine, uncomplicated love that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. The grief was a physical pain, a twisting in my gut. I was about to give up, convinced there was nothing there but ghosts, when I found a smaller, unmarked box tucked behind a stack of old records. Inside was a collection of papers from his first couple of years after college, the years right before he supposedly met Amelia. It was mostly junk, old utility bills, credit card offers, alumni newsletters. But at the very bottom, there was a folded bank statement from an institution I didn't recognize, Sterling Trust Financial. It was dated 7 years ago, just 3 months before his frantic, late-night call to me about his debt. My breath caught in my throat. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was a statement for a high-yield savings account. I scanned the columns of numbers, my eyes searching for anything unusual. And then I saw it. A single, massive deposit. $100,000. My mind reeled. Daniel had received a $100,000 deposit just weeks before he came to me, broke and terrified, claiming he owed a loan shark $150,000. It made no sense. Where had this money come from? And more importantly, where had it gone? If he had this money, why did he need mine? Why had I been forced to sell my mother's ring, to work myself to the bone, to live in poverty for 7 years? I felt a wave of nausea. This was bigger and darker than I could have imagined. I was about to fold the paper back up, my mind numb with confusion, when my eyes caught something else, a detail printed in small type at the top of the page, right under Daniel's name. Secondary account holder, Amelia Davenport. Davenport, that was her maiden name. I stared at the name, my heart hammering against my ribs. Amelia. She was on a joint bank account with my brother 2 years before they officially met. The $100,000 deposit wasn't just his, it was theirs. The entire foundation of my understanding of the past 7 years crumbled into dust. They had been together all along. The story of their meeting, the whirlwind romance, it was all a carefully constructed lie. And this lie was somehow connected to Daniel's debt, to Marco, and to the $100,000 that had appeared and vanished from this secret account. The hatred, the condescension, the systematic campaign to push me out of Daniel's life, it all snapped into focus. It was never about my second-hand clothes or my humble home. It was about this statement. It was about this secret. I was the one person who knew the before. I was the living, breathing reminder of a time when Daniel was supposedly alone and struggling. My very existence was a threat to their fabricated history. They needed me gone, silenced, discredited, so that no one would ever question their story. And Daniel, my sweet Daniel, was not a victim in this. He was her accomplice. He had stood by and watched her humiliate me, allowed her to poison our relationship because he was protecting this lie with her. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen the lie over the truth. My grief hardened into a cold, diamond-hard anger. They had not just betrayed me, they had stolen 7 years of my life. They had let me live in poverty, sacrificing my health and my future to pay off a debt that, for all I knew, they had created together. The $150,000 he owed Marco, was it possible the $100,000 they'd received was part of it? Had something gone wrong? I carefully folded the bank statement and put it in my pocket. This was it. This was the proof I needed. It was more than just a piece of paper, it was a weapon. But I knew I had to be smart. Rushing in with accusations would be foolish. They were liars and they were clearly desperate. There was no telling what they would do if they felt cornered. I needed more information. I needed to understand what had happened to that money and why the debt to Marco still existed. My first stop would be the bank. Sterling Trust Financial. It was a long shot, but I had to try. I wouldn't be able to get account details, but maybe, just maybe, I could find out something about the nature of the account or if it was still active. I walked out of the attic and back into my life, but I was a different woman. The quiet, long-suffering Clara was gone. In her place was a woman with a mission, a woman who had been pushed too far and had nothing left to lose. The next morning, I dressed with unusual care. I chose a crisp blouse and a pair of tailored trousers I'd saved for job interviews. I wanted to look professional, credible, not like the sad little charity project Amelia had described. I found the address for the nearest Sterling Trust branch online. It was downtown, in the heart of the financial district, a world away from my quiet, residential street. As I walked to my car, clutching my purse with the precious bank statement inside, I noticed a sleek black sedan parked across the street. It was the kind of expensive car that didn't belong in my neighborhood. I felt a prickle of unease. As I pulled out of my driveway, the sedan pulled out behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my discovery had made me jumpy. But the car stayed behind me for several blocks, maintaining a careful distance. When I turned onto the main road, it turned too. My heart began to pound. I made a sudden, unplanned right turn into a residential cul-de-sac. The black sedan followed. There was no doubt now. I was being watched. Amelia and Daniel weren't just protecting a lie. They were actively monitoring me. The game had just become infinitely more dangerous. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, washed over me. This wasn't just a family drama anymore. This was something else entirely. Being followed was a tactic of intimidation, a clear message: we see you. Back off. My first instinct was to drive straight home, lock the doors, and hide. But the anger that had been simmering inside me for the past 24 hours boiled over, eclipsing my fear. They were not going to scare me away from the truth. Not after everything. I needed to lose them. I was on a quiet residential street, the worst possible place for evasive maneuvers. Thinking fast, I sped up, turned a sharp corner, and then another, trying to get back to a busier road. The sedan stayed with me, its movements smooth and professional. They were good. I remembered a multi-level parking garage attached to a shopping center a few miles away. It was a labyrinth of concrete and steel, my only hope. I floored the accelerator, my old car groaning in protest. I weaved through traffic, ignoring the blare of angry horns. I could see the black sedan in my rearview mirror, closing the distance. I shot into the entrance of the parking garage, grabbing a ticket without stopping, and spiraled up the ramps as fast as I dared. On the third level, I saw an empty spot near the central stairwell. I pulled in sharply, killed the engine, and grabbed my purse. Without a second thought, I ran for the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clattered down the concrete steps, burst out onto the ground floor, and pushed my way into the bustling shopping center, disappearing into the anonymous midday crowd. I didn't stop moving for a full 10 minutes, weaving through department stores and crowded food courts, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone following me. I had made it. Shaking, I found a seat in a noisy coffee shop, my back to the wall, and ordered a coffee I didn't want. I needed to think. The fact that they had me followed changed everything. It confirmed my suspicions and raised the stakes to a terrifying new level. They were so desperate to protect their secret that they were willing to employ tactics straight out of a spy movie. What kind of situation, with a lone shark, required this level of paranoia? It was becoming clearer that Marco was more than just a thuggish debt collector. I took the folded bank statement out of my purse and looked at it again, as if it might reveal more secrets. Sterling Trust Financial. The plan was still the same, but the execution had to be different. I couldn't just walk in there. If they were watching me, they would know where I was going. I finished my coffee, my mind racing. I needed a new approach, a way to get information without tipping them off. I left the mall through a different exit and took a taxi to the downtown library, a place where I knew I could think clearly. I found a quiet carrel and logged onto a public computer. First, I did a deep dive into Sterling Trust Financial. It wasn't a standard retail bank. It was a private wealth management firm, specializing in high-net-worth individuals and offshore accounts. It was the kind of place that valued discretion above all else, which meant my chances of getting any information as a walk-in were zero. Next, I searched for Amelia Davenport and her family. They were prominent but not famous. Her father was a real estate mogul, known for aggressive and sometimes controversial development projects. There were a few articles about lawsuits and bitter business disputes. The Davenports were clearly powerful and not afraid to play dirty. Finally, with a deep breath, I typed Marco and Sterling Trust into the search bar. The results were sparse and encrypted in the coded language of financial crime, but there were whispers. Forum posts on financial watchdog sites mentioned a man named Marco Velez, a fixer who allegedly helped wealthy clients move money discreetly, often through firms like Sterling Trust. He wasn't just a loan shark, he was a money launderer. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with sickening clarity. The $100,000 deposited into Daniel and Amelia's joint account wasn't a gift or an investment. It was dirty money. And Marco Velez was the man who had cleaned it for them. The debt Daniel had come to me with, what if it wasn't a gambling debt at all? What if the $150,000 was Marco's fee? Or what if it was money that was lost in the laundering process? The story Daniel had fed me, the shame, the bad investments, the fear, it was all an elaborate performance designed to get me to pay off their debt to a dangerous criminal. They had used my love, my loyalty, my protective instincts as a tool. They had sentenced me to 7 years of hard labor and poverty to clean up their own filthy mess. And all the while, they were living in luxury, building their perfect life on a foundation of lies, a life financed by my sacrifice and their crime. Amelia's hatred wasn't just about protecting a secret, it was the classic disdain of the user for the used. Every time she looked at me, she saw a living embodiment of her own dirty conscience. She despised me because I was the dupe in her and Daniel's long con. The rage that filled me was pure and cold. It burned away the last vestiges of grief for the brother I had lost. That brother had never existed. He had been replaced by a weak, craven man who would let his own sister live in poverty to protect himself and his wealthy, corrupt wife. I now had a theory, a terrifying and plausible one. But I still needed more than a bank statement and a few cryptic internet posts. I needed to connect the dots in a way that was irrefutable. I thought about the car that had followed me. They were sloppy. They had revealed their hand. They had shown me that they were scared, and that gave me an advantage. I decided to use their paranoia against them. I took a different taxi back to the mall, picked up my car, and drove home, checking my rearview mirror constantly. No one was following me now. That evening, I made a phone call. It was to a man I hadn't spoken to in years, a private investigator named Frank Murphy. He was a grizzled ex-cop who had helped me once before, tracking down a tenant who had skipped out on rent in a small property I used to own. He was expensive, but he was discreet and he was the best. "Frank, it's Clara," I said when he answered. "I have a problem, a big one, and I think it might be dangerous." I met him the next day in a noisy diner on the other side of town. I laid it all out for him, the overheard conversation, the bank statement, the money launderer being followed. I even told him the full story of the 7-year debt I had been paying. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable, occasionally jotting notes on a small pad. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "Clara," he said finally, his voice a low grumble, "you're in over your head. These are not nice people. If what you suspect is true, they're not just liars, they're criminals. And criminals do not react well to being exposed." "I know," I said, my voice steady, "but I can't let them get away with it. They stole 7 years of my life, Frank. They used me. I need to know the whole truth, and I need to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." He looked at me, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to find out everything you can about the connection between Daniel, Amelia, her father, and Marco Velez. I need to know where that $100,000 came from and where it went. And I need evidence that I can take to the authorities." "This will be expensive," he warned. "I don't care," I said, thinking of the ledger in my desk, the record of the $126,000 I had already paid. "I've already paid a fortune. What's a little more?" Frank got to work immediately. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in a state of heightened alert. I varied my routines, I double-checked my locks, and I never drove anywhere without checking for a tail. I received cryptic text messages from Frank, "Making progress. The father is the key. Be careful." The waiting was agonizing. I threw myself into my art, spending hours in my workshop carving more birds, the repetitive motion a balm for my frayed nerves. I was creating a whole flock now, an army of silent wooden witnesses to the storm that was about to break. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, Frank called. "I've got it," he said, his voice tense. "And it's worse than you thought. Meet me at the usual place in an hour. And don't let anyone follow you." The diner was nearly empty. Frank was sitting in a back booth, a thick manila envelope on the table in front of him. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Your sister-in-law's father, Mr. Davenport," he began, without any preamble, "has been using his real estate company as a front for a massive money laundering operation for years. He cleans cash for some very unpleasant people." He pushed the envelope towards me. "Your brother wasn't a gambler. He was a pawn. When he started working at the bank, Davenport and Amelia saw an opportunity. Daniel was a bright, ambitious kid with access to internal bank systems. They targeted him. Amelia wasn't a chance encounter. She was an assignment. Her job was to get close to him, to seduce him, to get him under their control." I felt a chill seep into my bones. Daniel hadn't just fallen in with a bad crowd, he had been systematically recruited. The $100,000 you saw on that statement, Frank continued, was a test, a trial run. They had Daniel use his position at the bank to help them move that money through a series of shell accounts. He was good at it, but he got greedy or maybe just scared. He skimmed $10,000 for himself. He thought no one would notice. My heart sank. Daniel, my Daniel, was a thief. But people like Marco Velez notice everything, Frank said grimly. Marco was the fixer for this particular transaction. When he found out about the skimmed money, he was not pleased. The $150,000 debt wasn't from gambling. It was a penalty. It was Marco's way of teaching Daniel a lesson and making sure he never stepped out of line again. They cooked up the whole gambling story to get you to pay it. It was perfect. They kept their pawn in line, and they didn't have to pay a dime. They made his sister, the one person who could have been a problem for them, foot the bill. I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. Pictures of Amelia and her father meeting with Marco Velez in a hotel lobby. Copies of wire transfers between shell corporations, controlled by Davenport, and accounts linked to Marco. And the final, devastating piece of evidence. A sworn, notarized affidavit from a former employee of Davenport's company, a bookkeeper who had decided to turn informant. He detailed the entire operation, explicitly naming Amelia and Daniel as active participants. It was all there. The whole sordid, ugly truth. My brother was not a victim. He was a criminal. He had willingly participated in a money laundering scheme, stolen money, and then conspired with his wife and her father to make me pay for his crime. Every sacrifice I had made, every tear I had shed had been for a lie. What do I do now? I whispered, my voice hoarse. You have a choice, Frank said. You can take this to the feds. They'll be very interested. Davenport, Amelia, your brother, they'll all go to prison for a very long time, or you can walk away. Forget you ever knew any of this. But they know you've been digging. They won't just leave you alone. Walk away? How could I walk away? They had stolen my life, my family, my security. They had done it without a shred of remorse. And they were about to bring a child into their world of filth and corruption. The thought of that innocent baby being raised by wolves like them made my decision for me. I'm not walking away, I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. They need to be stopped. Good, Frank said, a small smile touching his lips. But we're not going to the feds. Not yet. First, we're going to give them a chance to do the right thing. It's time for a family meeting. He explained his plan. It was audacious, risky, and utterly terrifying. But it was also perfect. It was a plan that would give me back not just my money, but my power. The next day, I sent a single text message to my brother. I know everything. About Amelia, about her father, about Sterling Trust. About Marco, we need to talk. My house, tomorrow at noon. Come alone. If you bring anyone else, or if I see a single black sedan on my street, the contents of this envelope go straight to the FBI. I attached a single photo from Frank's collection, a crystal-clear shot of Amelia shaking hands with Marco Velez. The 24 hours that followed were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my workshop, surrounded by my silent army of birds, and waited. I was terrified, but I was also strangely calm. I had the truth on my side, and for the first time in 7 years, I was the one in control. At precisely noon the next day, Daniel's car pulled into my driveway. He got out of the car, his face ashen, his hands trembling. He looked 10 years older than he had at the baby shower. He was alone. The trap was set. Now it was time to see if my brother, the real Daniel, was still in there somewhere, buried beneath all the lies. He walked into my small living room, and the space seemed to shrink around him. He wasn't the confident, successful man I had seen at Thanksgiving. He was a ghost, haunted by the secrets he had kept. He looked around at the worn furniture, the patched wallpaper, the physical evidence of the life I had been living while he was playing the part of a wealthy banker. For the first time, I think he truly saw it. I didn't offer him a seat. I stood by the fireplace, the manila envelope in my hand, and let the silence stretch until it was taut and humming with unspoken accusations. Clara, I can explain, he finally whispered, his voice cracking. Can you? I asked, my own voice devoid of any emotion. It was a cold, flat thing. Can you explain the joint account with Amelia Davenport at Sterling Trust, opened 2 years before you supposedly met her? Can you explain a $100,000 deposit? Or should we start with your business associate, Marco Velez? Every word was a physical blow. He flinched, his face crumpling. You don't understand, it wasn't like that. I was trapped. Trapped? I let out a short, bitter laugh. Let me tell you what trapped is, Daniel. Trapped is working 2 jobs, scrubbing other people's toilets, so your brother can have a roof over his head. Trapped is selling your own mother's wedding ring so he can have a new laptop, only to find out he spent it on a designer handbag for the woman who was helping him ruin you. Trapped is living on soup and bread for 7 years, your body aching with exhaustion, while paying off a gangster so your brother doesn't get his legs broken over a gambling debt that never existed. I threw the envelope onto the coffee table between us. The photographs and papers spilled out. He stared at the picture of Amelia and Marco, then at the copies of the wire transfers, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I was young. I was stupid, he stammered, sinking onto the sofa without being asked. Davenport offered me a way to make real money to get ahead. He said it was just moving some funds around, creative accounting. I didn't know what it really was, not at first. Amelia, she was part of the deal. She made sure I stayed in line. So you were a victim, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. A poor, innocent boy seduced by a wicked woman and her evil father. But victims don't skim $10,000 from money launderers, do they, Danny? That was your mistake. That's what brought Marco down on you. And instead of facing the consequences of your own crime, you came to me. You invented a story, you cried on my shoulder, and you let me take the punishment for you. Tears were streaming down his face now, silent, pathetic tears of self-pity. I was going to pay you back. I swear, Clara, as soon as I could, I was going to make it right. When? I shot back, my voice finally rising, filled with the fury of 7 years of betrayal. When were you going to make it right? When you were picking out new furniture for your $500,000 house? When you were planning a vacation to Europe? When you stood by and watched your wife mock my poverty, a poverty you created and benefited from every single day? You weren't going to pay me back. You were waiting for me to die so the problem would just go away. The raw truth of the accusation hung in the air between us, undeniable and ugly. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just sat there, a broken man, stripped of all his lies. What do you want, Clara? He finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. What I want, I said, stepping closer, my voice dropping back to that icy calm, is my life back. But since you can't give me that, we'll settle for justice and restitution. I laid out my terms, the plan Frank and I had carefully constructed. First, you will pay me back every cent. The $126,000 I have paid to Marco so far, plus the final $24,000 to close the debt. On top of that, you will pay me $350,000 in damages. For my lost wages, for the emotional distress, for the 7 years of my life that you and your wife stole from me. The total is $500,000. I want it transferred to an account of my choosing by the end of the week. He stared at me aghast. $500,000. Clara, I don't have that kind of money. Don't you? I replied coolly. Then you'd better ask your father-in-law. I'm sure he can find it. Consider it a business expense, the cost of keeping your golden goose out of a federal prison. Second, I continued, ignoring his panicked expression. You will walk away from them, from Amelia, from her father, from their entire corrupt enterprise, and you will confess. You will go to the FBI with a lawyer of my choosing, and you will tell them everything. You will be the star witness in the case against Thomas Davenport. It's your only chance at a reduced sentence, your only chance to not spend the next 20 years behind bars. They'll kill me, he breathed, his eyes wide with terror. Marco, Davenport's people, they'll kill me. They'll kill you if you don't, I said flatly. Because my third and final condition is this. If you do not agree to every single one of my terms, if you hesitate for even a second, I will walk out of this house and I will give this envelope to the authorities. I have copies, Daniel. They are in safe hands. Harming me will do you no good. The information will still get out. Your life as you know it is over. The only choice you have left is what comes next. A prison cell as a co-conspirator, or a witness protection program as a man who finally, after 7 years, decided to do the right thing. He looked from the evidence on the table to my unyielding face. He was trapped, truly trapped this time, not by a lone shark, but by the consequences of his own actions. I could see the war raging inside him, the fear of the Davenports versus the fear of federal prison. As if on cue, a car door slammed outside. We both froze. Through the front window, I saw Amelia getting out of her car, her face a mask of cold fury. She had followed him. My heart leaped into my throat, but I held my ground. This was it, the final confrontation. She burst through the door without knocking. "Daniel, what are you doing? You don't talk to her without me or my father present. You know the rules." Her eyes landed on the papers spilled across the coffee table, and she stopped dead, her breath hissing between her teeth. "What is this?" "It's over, Amelia," I said, stepping between her and my brother. "You," she sneered, her eyes narrowing with pure hatred. "You pathetic old woman. You have no idea what you're messing with." "Oh, I think I do," I said, picking up the photo of her and Marco. "I'm messing with a criminal enterprise run by your father. I'm messing with a money launderer and his pet banker. And I'm messing with the woman who thought she could destroy my life and get away with it." "Daniel, we're leaving," she commanded, grabbing his arm. But he didn't move. He just stared at the floor, paralyzed. "He's not going anywhere with you," I said. "He's got a choice to make. And I think, for the first time in a very long time, he's considering telling the truth." Amelia laughed, a high, brittle sound. "The truth? He doesn't even know what that is anymore. He belongs to us. We own him." "No one owns him," I said, my voice ringing with a strength that surprised even me. "He is my brother. And you people, you turned him into a monster. But I am giving him one last chance to be a man again." I looked at Daniel, my eyes boring into his. "Now, Daniel, you choose. Her world of lies and crime or a chance at redemption. Who are you?" The silence was absolute. Amelia's grip on his arm was like a vice. He looked at her, at the beautiful, cold woman who had been his partner in deceit, the mother of his unborn child. Then he looked at me, at the sister he had betrayed, the last link to a life of decency he had thrown away. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his arm free from her grasp. "I'm done, Amelia," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I'm done lying." The rage on Amelia's face was terrifying to behold. Her mask of civility was gone, replaced by the raw, vicious snarl of a cornered animal. "You weak, ungrateful fool." She shrieked. "We gave you everything." "You gave me a cage," he said quietly, "and Clara is giving me the key." Amelia lunged for the papers on the table, but I was faster. I swept them back into the envelope and held it to my chest. "It's too late," I said. "There are copies. Lots of them. It's over." She stared at me, her chest heaving, her mind clearly racing as she processed the finality of her defeat. Then her expression shifted. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across her face. "You think you've won," she said softly. "You think you can take him away from me. I'm pregnant with his child, your nephew. He will never be free of me. We will always be connected." It was her last, desperate move, an attempt to use her baby as a final shackle. But Daniel, my Daniel, the one who had been buried for so long, finally stood up. "You will not use our child the way you used me," he said, his voice filled with a newfound authority. "He will not be raised in your father's world of filth. I will make sure of it." He looked at me, his eyes filled with 7 years of unshed tears. "I'll do it, Clara. I'll confess. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes." Amelia let out a strangled cry of fury and stormed out of the house, her tires squealing as she tore down the street. We were left in the sudden, deafening silence. Daniel collapsed back onto the sofa and finally began to sob, not with self-pity, but with the gut-wrenching grief of a man who has come face to face with the wreckage of his own life. I did not go to him. I did not comfort him. I simply stood there and let him cry. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of lawyers and federal agents. Frank Murphy handled everything, connecting us with the right people, ensuring Daniel had protection. True to his word, Daniel told them everything. The dam of lies had broken, and a flood of truth poured out. His testimony, combined with the evidence Frank had gathered, was enough to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. Thomas Davenport was arrested in a pre-dawn raid. His assets were frozen, his empire dismantled. Amelia, facing charges of conspiracy and money laundering, cut a deal, turning on her own father in exchange for a lighter sentence. Daniel, as the key witness, was placed in the Witness Protection Program. The $500,000 was recovered from a frozen Davenport account and transferred to me. On the day before he was scheduled to disappear into his new life, he called me one last time. "There's nothing I can say that will ever be enough, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," I replied. There was nothing more to say. The chasm between us was too wide, filled with too much pain and betrayal. Forgiveness was a country I wasn't ready to visit. "Goodbye, Danny," I said softly, and hung up the phone. With the money, I paid off the final installment to Marco, a transaction handled discreetly by Frank that officially closed the darkest chapter of my life. Then I sold the little house with all its ghosts. I bought a small, light-filled cottage by the sea, a place where I could breathe again. I built a large, airy workshop and filled it with wood and tools. I never heard from Daniel or Amelia again. I read in the paper that she had her baby, a boy. A part of me ached for that innocent child, born into such a legacy of ruin, but I knew he was not mine to worry about. My path was my own now. My life is quiet, but it is not lonely. Frank comes to visit sometimes, bringing fresh fish from the market. I have friends in the small seaside town, other artists and craftspeople who value me for who I am, not what I can give them. Most days, you can find me in my workshop, the scent of cedar and salt in the air. I carve birds, hundreds of them. They line the shelves and hang from the rafters, a silent, colorful flock. They are not just pieces of wood. Each one is a piece of my story. A testament to the fact that even after the most brutal of storms, it is possible to find your wings again. My name is Clara, and I am finally free. If you were Clara, would you have exposed them or walked away? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, betrayal, and redemption.